How's everybody doing? All right, got some thumbs up. That's good. That's always good to see before lunch. Nobody's fallen asleep yet or has bailed to go to another talk yet. Yeah, so I'm here, which is great. I wasn't able to make it last year because they canceled my flight and then booked me on another flight, which they then canceled. And then this time they've lost my bag. So I'm just, yeah, it never ends. So they're not delivering it to me. So I'm just going to go to the airport tomorrow. My flight is tomorrow, my flight home, and just pick up my bag and then literally check it back in. So. It's just not even worth going to the airport to collect. So anyway, this is not about my travel woes. This is about open source for closed source companies. If that is the talk you came to see, you are in the right spot. So a bit about me. My name is Amanda Folson. I do developer relations at Nexmo. Prior to that, I worked at a company called GitLab, and they basically do open source GitHub, I guess is the shortest way to explain that. Prior to that, I worked at a company called PagerDuty, and I'm going to talk about all of these different companies today a little bit. And I grew up around computers. My dad was a developer in the 90s, so I grew up around Visual Basic books and VB Script. Anybody do VB Script back in the day? Yeah, okay. So that was my world for a little while. We built my first computer when I was around 7 years old, and yeah, I've always been tinkering with things, started writing little dinky things here and there. And in middle school, I was making websites and eventually found PHP. I made a Neopets clone because that was the thing that you did at the time. Anybody play Neopets? No, probably not. got one person who was willing to admit that. And then I continued doing PHP and eventually found this thing called IRC, which was pretty cool. And then started to get involved in IRC development as well. So started doing C and started working on services. I started submitting patches. And at the time, submitting a patch was really just me saying like, hey, here's this file that I modified. Please do something with it. And they were ecstatic about that. They were able to patch it up and I eventually got commit access, which was really cool. And I was able to make changes to anything that I wanted pretty much. And then that work led me to explore other types of technology. I eventually needed a web server for some of the things I was doing, needed MySQL and all that good stuff. And that led me to getting a job as a technical writer, and that opened even more doors for me. And now I have a job at Nexmo where we're shipping open source software. Again, worked at GitLab where the product was actually open source as well. So I simply wouldn't be where I am today without all of these open source things. Open source really has done a lot for me as far as my career goes. So what is open source? People have varying definitions, but in general, you're releasing source code under a permissive license to allow other people to use it. And there are a lot of licenses. There's something called the Open Source Initiative and even GitHub. They have all of these tools to help you break down the licenses and figure out which license might be better for your project. And you're sure to find one that's going to work for you or your project, even if you're worried about IP law and intellectual property. Putting your code out there allows for adaptation. It allows for bug fixes, new features, new releases, bug reports, things like that. And the nice thing about this is that all of this can be done at a global scale. So whether you're a team of 5 people, 5,000 people, you can do this with people all over the world. I work with people on every continent except for Antarctica, but we're trying. We're trying to get to Antarctica just to say that we are working with somebody there. It'll probably be me going there on vacation and pretending to work, but it counts. So some people are doing this in their spare time. Other people are want to make changes and they want those changes to be applied upstream. Very few companies can hire the amount of people working on some of these projects. So you're probably not going to be able to hire several hundred people. However, getting several hundred contributors is probably a lot easier for you to do. Sorry, these slide transitions are really slow for some reason. Again. All right, there we go. So what open source isn't, a lot of people think that open source is just giving it all away for free. They're giving away their bread and butter. They think that they're going to go broke if they do something like that. Just as an example, Rackspace has this thing called OpenStack. And with OpenStack, you can spin up servers, create infrastructure, basically spin up your own cloud, whether it's a hybrid cloud or actual physical servers. And they're still a billion-dollar company. That's core infrastructure for them. They're still around. Red Hat is another company. They release everything that they have, and they make all of their money off of support contracts and things, and that's just their business model. and they're also a billion-dollar company. So even parts of Windows and Azure, those have been open sourced. Microsoft is still fine. Really, you're exchanging your source code for rapid development, and this is especially true at larger companies. So some of these projects, particularly OpenStack, have thousands of commits per month from hundreds of people, and that's not something that Rackspace could have bought. I mean, even though they're a billion-dollar company, it just wouldn't have been cost-effective for them to do that. So you're giving it away so that someone else can run this and modify it to suit their needs, and you're letting people scratch their own itches in some cases so that you don't have to. But open source is really not giving away your business, and that's, I think, the most common misconception that I hear from people. Really, don't ever underestimate the power of lazy. A lot of people can't or won't self-host this stuff. They don't have the power to do a lot of these things themselves. As much as they want to talk about doing that, really, most people are probably not going to be able to. Come on. So I talk to a lot of people, as I do, talking about the open source stuff, who are just terrified at the thought of open sourcing their software. And that's fine. That's perfectly fine. And they tell me things like, oh, we can't do that. And it's like, well, why not? Why can't you do that? Like, okay, sure, you think that you can't do this, but why? And they think that they'll lose control over their project, or that they'll go out of business, or that competitors will steal their stuff. When I worked at PagerDuty, we had this messaging pipeline, and there were all these different microservices inside of this pipeline, and basically this pipeline was responsible for waking you up when something was broken. And that's something that we wouldn't want to release. So in addition to the pipeline code, how we actually spun that up and kept it online, we're in the business of waking people up when their stuff falls over, so we need to make sure that our stuff isn't falling over. There are things that are secret sauce, things that you wouldn't necessarily want to release, but something like the web panel, the web front end to PagerDuty, we actually did open source part of that, and big deal. That it was something where we got other people to come in and help us with that. We allowed other people to come in and fix their pain points. But if someone really wanted to steal that and do something with it, have at it. You still have to build that entire back end. So that was a way for us to allow other people to contribute and fix some of the little UI things, scheduling things, even some of the back end things that we were comfortable releasing without having to release the entire thing, and PagerDuty's still around. This one is my favorite. People who tell me, oh, there's absolutely no value to open source. And they will typically say this from their Windows PC or their Mac, both of which contain open source libraries, particularly around the TCP/IP stack. They'll say this on Facebook and Twitter, both of which make use of all sorts of open source technologies, and both of which are actually pretty open about their open source projects. Or they say this on their WordPress website. But if you hear this, I really encourage you to challenge people on this, because the value of open source software is actually demonstrable. So we still have some work to educate people on how powerful open source software actually is. It's in your smart TVs, it's in your smartphone. I mentioned the TCP/IP stack. A lot of those things are open source libraries on your phone, and HTTP magic. So a lot of people are just really uninformed about this, so they don't necessarily understand the value of open source software. Another thing that I hear is that, oh, well, we still have to hire somebody to maintain it. And my response to that really is, so what? It's still cheaper than hiring multiple in-house engineers or multiple contractors to do these things for you. And it's also not true. Does anybody really follow like the PHP core project? Okay. So there's a lot of volunteers that do the heavy lifting. So PHP is not necessarily like a for-profit thing, but there's a lot of people who just show up and get involved and start doing things in PHP core on the internals mailing list. People just pop up all the time, and they do all of these very heavy lifting sorts of things. And it's really not uncommon to see community managers or developer relations people in positions like this to help give the project scope and help keep things on track and help people figure out the things that need to be done versus the things that are really not necessarily a priority. So they're really providing the community with the guidance, and then the community really takes it from there. And more often than not, that's what you see towards the end of these projects. The number one opposition that I hear to open source is around money. As Well, yeah, that's not that surprising. So people are afraid of losing money, which is a very healthy thing. They like to know that they're going to stay in business. Again, a very healthy thing. And here's the thing. If your idea is good, people are going to build on it. They're going to want to build on that idea. And the best part is, even if they build on your idea and are not necessarily releasing the source code, you still benefit from that. So you can see what the market wants or what it desires through the work of other people. You might run into some leechers too. Leechers are people who take your source code, they make modifications to it, and then they don't release it, or they try and brand it as their own. Those people are absolutely out there, and you see them all the time. But they're probably not going to be successful. Most of the time, these projects don't get enough traction to actually influence your project. But sometimes they do overtake you, and if that happens, it's really an opportunity for you to reel things back in to your project or nurture this new project or this new community that's spun up around something that you created. And it's definitely not the end of the world. It doesn't mean that you're going to go out of business. It doesn't mean that someone has stolen your project by any means. But the reality is you could very well be overtaken. You just have no idea as you're spinning this up. You don't know ahead of time. Leechers also fail because there's a lot more to the product than the code, and that's something that is really often overlooked by people who are looking to open source things. So going back to Rackspace here for a second, they're selling you an experience. So yeah, they're using OpenStack internally, and that's great. You can use that too, but they're also selling you on this whole ecosystem of things around basically what they've built on top of OpenStack. So they're big on their fanatical support and everything like that. That's something that you're not really going to be able to replicate. Other people are not easily going to be able to replicate. So even if someone takes your code and creates a competing business with it, which is plausible, there's no guarantee that they can provide that same experience for you. People and ideas are a very important factor in this. There's a lot more to this than just the source code here. Something else I hear is, oh, someone's going to steal my idea. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard this from people with really actually crappy ideas. So unfortunately, and this is a hard truth, your idea is probably not that unique. So if you're creating a cloud on OpenStack, for example, you're joining literally thousands of people who are doing the exact same thing. Even people have created competing businesses with Rackspace. But there's thousands of people who do this. And some of the control panel things might be a little different, but at the end of the day, it's all servers in a rack somewhere serving stuff. And that's not really all that unique. Facebook isn't unique. Social networks were a thing long before Facebook was ever in the picture. Anybody remember MySpace? Yeah, exactly. Which it's still around. I did find out recently that MySpace still exists. Photo sharing was a thing before Instagram. Search engines actually existed before Google. Google was not the first one to that party. So never underestimate the power of marketing and positioning either. It's a huge factor here if you're going to reinvent the wheel, which, spoiler, you probably are. Your wheel might look a little different, but at the end of the day, it's still a wheel. And another spoiler, nobody cares about your idea as much as you do. It's another hard truth. But if they did, they would just go off and build it themselves. If someone is truly that passionate about something, they're just going to go do it. And this happens from time to time, but typically one project will pull ahead of the other project. Linux versus the herd kernel, that was a good example where Linux obviously won that, but herd still exists and it does similar things. It's not really that actively worked on, while Linux absolutely is. So value is subjective, and what's valuable to you might not be valuable to someone else. So that's something to keep in mind as you're going through open source. So we've burned through some excuses here and regarding open source and why people can't open source their projects and why they're not really true. But let's talk about how open source can help within an organization here. Maybe we'll get a slide. So something that's really helpful about open source is that you can try it before you buy it. And who doesn't love trying something before you have to commit to buying it? So in addition to code, the bug fixes, the features, and things like that, you get some other benefits from releasing your software too. So people typically want to get in, get answers, and get on with life. They want to see if something's going to work for them. And this is especially true of technical people. So People like us don't really respond to traditional sales and marketing tactics. We don't want to be sold a thing. We want to look at the thing and see if that thing is going to work for us. But if people have visibility into your product, either through documentation or through open source code, either way, you're opening yourself up to more feedback. People can get in and ask questions or get in and tell you, hey, this is going to work for me. Hey, this isn't going to work for me. And the thing with that is you win whether they come on board or not. So even if somebody doesn't actually convert to becoming a customer, you still have their feedback. You can still ask them questions. They can still ask you questions about this. And you can incorporate that into your product. And if it does work for them, well, then hopefully you win a customer, and that's another win. And another thing that's true in tech is that we're really vocal about stuff. If anybody follows me on Twitter, you've seen me ranting about the airline thing pretty regularly recently. It's been very obnoxious, and going on Twitter and just ranting about things. I'm not even as upset as I probably seem on Twitter, but it's just cathartic, right? This thing made me angry, and I need to let the world know about it. We are especially vocal about the things that we don't like. And when we know what to expect, we're a lot happier with that. Another thing that's important to keep in mind is that one size doesn't necessarily fit all. And what works for you may not actually work for somebody else. So as one person, for me, something like OpenStack is completely overkill. I may just need a Zenbox somewhere. Or maybe I can do what I need to do with a bunch of Vagrant or Docker machines, something to that effect. OpenStack would absolutely be overkill for me. But the thing is I have the freedom to explore all of my options. So yeah, I can look at OpenStack and say, this is a level of crazy that I don't need in my life right now. I can look at Docker and say, okay, this makes a lot of sense for what I'm trying to do. I need to deploy these little things. I want them to be containerized a little bit. Or I might just say, here's a Vagrant machine with everything, and maybe that'll work for me, and maybe I can deploy things that way. But I can explore all of those options, which is really nice. And even better, it doesn't cost me a dime to do. So, but the end result with this is that I know about these products, and even though I'm not using them, I can talk to other people about them and talk to other people who may be in the same predicament as me and trying to evaluate options. And maybe somebody does need something more complicated than just a server on a box somewhere. Maybe somebody actually does need something like OpenStack, or maybe they need some other hybrid cloud option. It's a really positive thing to have that software diversity so that we can evaluate all of our options. And the nice thing about if the source code being open is that if something's not working for me, I have the power to tweak it. And even if I don't necessarily have the knowledge to be able to tweak it, I can at least open an issue and put as much information as I possibly can in there, and someone else might hop on there and try and fix it, particularly during like Hacktoberfest or something. So you'll recall that I mentioned working on IRC things earlier, and that really just started out as me making modules for little dinky things that I thought nobody would use, and then eventually people started using them. And I had no idea at the time. I was just like, I'm bored, I'm gonna make a module to do this thing, and now users of the software benefit from those changes, and they still do to this day, and this happened over 10 years ago, so those modules are still getting downloads and things. So I thought it was insignificant, but it actually ended up being pretty popular. And it's nice to allow people to be able to tweak these things, and those changes might even benefit you. One size may not fit all, but it can kind of fit many people. So it'll fit many, many more if your users have a forum or something where they can establish quorum on what they actually need or what they're looking for. Hopefully, your product. A huge benefit that I think that's overlooked is information transparency, and this is where things start to be helpful to your organization. Too often we're really stuck in our own silos and we develop these blind spots to our product. So we're trying to stay ahead of the market, we're trying to stay competitive, and that results in some serious tunnel vision, and you might not notice the things that are going on around you or notice the customers who are complaining about your product or customers who are trying to make your product better. So we know what we want, and sometimes we incorporate feedback from customers, but we don't always know what the customer wants. And oftentimes we're actually afraid to ask them to. People don't want to pester their customers and ask them for that feedback. But even if they give us feedback, do we actually act on that? And in a lot of companies I've worked at, the answer is no. We catalog the feedback, we can tell you how many people have asked for that thing, but the number of times we've actually acted on it has been relatively low in some cases. So letting the customer control, or not necessarily control, but have some say in the direction of the product is actually a really good thing, as they often know more about their needs than you could ever hope to know, even through asking them. So let them have some control, some say, and give them what they need in order to succeed. And besides, sooner or later, if you make something nice and keep the product closed source, someone will make an open source alternative. If it's popular enough, someone is going to do it at some point in time. And that's just the way the world is these days. OpenOffice and LibreOffice went through that a little bit. Even though they were open source, initially they were copying, obviously, Office from Microsoft, and then they were eventually copying features from themselves, even though they were both open source. There are open source social networks. Mastodon seems to be the thing that everybody wants to mess with right now. There are open source operating systems that can look and feel like Windows or Mac. Linux has come a long way these days, and a lot of the tooling there has come a long way. And the thing about these projects is that these have market share. The reason that we know about these things is because other people know about them and because they became popular. So you may as well get that from the start. Okay, so I've blathered about why you should open source these things for a little bit, and let's say that I've failed to convince you to open source your software. That's totally fine, and as I mentioned before, that's totally okay in a lot of cases. It happens. There are some things that you can't open source for whatever reason. So I mentioned working at PagerDuty, and PagerDuty would have been silly to open source their ultra-reliable alerting pipeline. Reliability is a competitive advantage, and that is the sort of thing that is absolutely okay to keep closed-sourced. If you can find a way to open source it, great, but it is okay to not do that. But they do some things internally that are cool. So PagerDuty was one of the only companies I worked at that maintained a wiki that was actually up to date. It was beautiful, and people would curate it as things changed. That wiki would be up to date. You could go to that wiki and find information on anything you needed, and it was going to be reliable. A lot of the meetings that they had were open to the entire company, so you could just go and sit in on a finance meeting and learn about the finances of the company if that's something you were interested in. And as people were purchasing shares of the company, those meetings actually started to get a lot larger. Meetings with the CEO as well. People could hop into a meeting with the CEO and see what was going on at a high level with the direction of the company. There's also something called demo days, where if you were working on something, you could demo it off to the entire company. They happened every other Friday to give people time to build things, and they coincided with sprints. So you could demo what you had been working on, and it was a great way to see what other teams were doing. So I sat on a particular product team, and I really didn't have a lot of insight. Well, I had access to the insight, but I didn't have time to actually keep tabs on what everyone was doing. So the demo days were a nice way for me to see what was going on internally and see what other projects people were working on. They also had monthly all-hands meetings, and some people really like the all-hands meetings. Some people really don't like the all-hands meetings because it's typically 90 minutes of sitting there listening to things that you don't necessarily care about. But their all-hands meetings were actually run really well. They were all things that were relevant. They gave you highlights. People didn't sit there and blather for 30 minutes about their department, leaving only 5 minutes for someone else to talk about theirs. And it sounds like we had a lot of meetings, but in all actuality, we really didn't have a lot of meetings. Anything that was over 30 minutes that didn't have an agenda, you could just cancel. So all the meetings had to have agendas. Things that were able to be public were public, so those meeting agendas were public. You could see if you wanted to pop in and sit in on that. Of course, there were sometimes sensitive meetings where you didn't have an agenda, and that's fine. They were also really good about training, so we were agile, we did Scrum, and anybody in the company could go to the Scrum training, and everybody became a certified Scrum Master or a certified product owner, and that was an opportunity that they opened up to anybody, even people who were not on the Scrum teams, people in marketing, and it really helped everybody understand what other people were doing, and we started to see marketing get more involved in some of the sprint planning things as well, not necessarily to add a marketing spin to them or whatever, but to allow them to prepare the things that they needed to prepare in order to actually launch this particular product or this particular feature. So that was great. Executives also had office hours, so you could pretty much just pop in whenever you wanted and go talk to an executive, and they were very, very transparent about those. You could just book time on the calendar, and it was one of the only cases where you didn't need to have an agenda. You could just show up and start talking to them. So this was actually my Kanban board, and this was public to the entire company. The tasks Unfortunately, since I don't work there, they contained some sensitive information, so I did have to blur them out because I'm not trying to get sued. So I'm sorry for that, sorry for the blur. But anyway, this guy with this green avatar here was an intern who worked at the company. He answered to somebody outside of my department. He sort of floated around, but really was mostly in the HR side. And he saw this board one time and saw that it was overloaded and asked me what he could do to start helping out. So that was cool. That level of transparency allowed him to see, hey, she's got a lot of work on her plate. Let's see what we can do with that. And I started giving him basic tasks. Some of the DevRel things I were doing were sending stickers, sending t-shirts, or organizing things, putting some data into a spreadsheet. So I started giving him those things. And gradually, he started to get more curious about some of the other things that were on the board. He saw that I was working on these little code samples and asked me what he would need to do in order to learn how to help with some of those things. And this is a guy who had no idea that something like a terminal even existed. I pulled that up on his Mac the first time he asked me about this and started typing things, and it blew his mind. He was actually a little scared. He thought I was hacking him. So, I mean, this is a guy who just had no concept of these things. And really, through this open information, he was able to figure out something that he ended up becoming passionate about, which was really cool. And I'm not saying that this is going to be the normal case. I do consider this an edge case, but it was nice to see him get involved and start to learn more things. And he actually, to this day, still has code running in production. So this was 4 years ago or so now, and he still has code samples and things that are online, even though neither of us work at the company anymore. So it was really cool to see these things come together and to see us be able to collaborate on that and see him really learn how to do very basic code things. So through that open information, it really helped him along, and then it helped me too, because I wasn't the only person doing all of these things, and that was great. So this task that's over here in the done category was actually a documentation thing that someone decided to do over a weekend. I didn't ask her to do it. She just up and decided, hey, this is relevant to what I'm working on. I'm in here anyway. I'm just going to go ahead and do this thing. So she just knocked it out because it was important to what she was working on. So really, this level of transparency helped the entire team be better. So what you just saw is really a great example of cross-team functionality, and the only way we were able to do that is with that level of transparency. So having that board, having that wiki, having those meetings, it was the only way that we were able to make those things work, because it allowed other people to say, hey, I'm bored, I need something to do, let's see what other people are doing and jump right in and help with those things. So anybody can contribute to anything, and this is something that GitLab did really well as well. It's literally their tagline is anyone can contribute. It allows people to learn things and allows people to contribute, whether it's training or outside study or something that's happening internally with your trainings. It allows people to jump in. And I'm absolutely not saying that anybody should be able to become CEO for a day, or that anybody should be able to jump in and say, all right, I'm the finance manager, we're going to spend $1 million on this car that I really want. Something like that. I'm not saying that at all. Not saying that everybody should be allowed in board meetings or some of the more sensitive things, because I do think you can have too many people in some of these meetings. But it is okay to have some need to know things, just like it's okay to not release your bread and butter. But you should absolutely be giving back to open source if you're making use of open source in some way, even if you're not open sourcing your stuff. So in this case, the cross-functionality, I owned the project, but other people were able to contribute to it. So I established the guidelines. I owned the documentation, and I had a few simple rules. So first rule was no force pushes. That actually was a problem, and then I made it not a problem. Somebody would go and force push and just clobber everything, so that became not a problem. No deploys until testing passed, so we wanted to make sure that things like URLs worked, there weren't any egregious spelling errors, we had checks for all of that. And then everything must be edited and signed off on before going out. Those are my rules. They're not crazy, they're not too outlandish. And people follow those rules all the time. And more often than not, people don't want to inconvenience you by making you use their workflow. Every now and then we did get pushback, and someone was like, this is too complicated. I don't want to use Git to do this. I just want to tell you the changes. And I'm like, all right, fine, open a ticket. But more often than not, people were willing to contribute. So I handled the bug queue. I reviewed the PRs. I merged things as needed, deployed. But many other people were involved in making this project run smoothly. And again, that only happened because everything was so transparent. This is another thing that actually every single company I've worked at has done really, really well, and I consider myself very fortunate because there are people who haven't experienced this. Learning from failure has been a huge part of this, and this is something that is very, very difficult to do transparently because there's a lot of stigma around it. And it's perhaps the scariest part of working at an open company. So working at GitLab in particular, the failures were very, very public. We had an incident where we lost data. It took down our database. And we live streamed the entire thing, us getting this thing back online and fixing it. And it was terrifying. So not only can people see into our infrastructure as this guy is running things on the command line, but also we've got egg on our face. Like, we are really, really embarrassed about this thing, but all you can do is own it. And that starts with recognizing that everybody makes mistakes. So we're all human. We all do these things. Anybody taking down production? Yeah. See, you're not alone. You are in good company. And you have to realize that these are opportunities for learning. These are opportunities for improvement. And a lot of people don't look at them that way. They look at them as black marks and things that they need to be ashamed about, things that they don't want to talk about. So actually, as I was showing Captain Intern something, I broke the site, and I broke it badly. And there were actually, I would get paged if the documentation site went down. There were API health checks and things associated with that. So I took down that entire developer portal and some other things. And now he knows what not to do. So he doesn't necessarily know what to do, but he knows a lot about what not to do, and that is super valuable as well. So there's this concept of blameless postmortems, and they're very, very difficult to do, but you start by not blaming anybody. Nobody's getting blamed for this. Nobody's getting attacked for this. No one is getting fired for this. That's really important. Nobody should be fired for a bad deploy. It happens. It happens to everybody who is deploying code, and especially if you're deploying lots of little changes throughout the day. Sooner or later, it's going to happen. Really, unless it was blatantly reckless, firing people for this is not great. These failures they're simply great opportunities for us to improve and should be treated as such. And this is something that I really learned at PagerDuty, and it has followed me from job to job. And it absolutely is one of the most important parts of being a transparent organization. So I've talked about transparency, and transparency really is the secret to open source inside of your organization. So even if you are not open sourcing your project itself or the code itself, being open with your organization, which is still terrifying. It's still just as terrifying as thinking, oh, I'm going to lose my bread and butter, or my company's going to go bankrupt. People have the same misconceptions about bringing this internally. So what are some other ways we can promote transparency? Even if you can't open source your product, there are still other things that people don't think about. They think, oh, I just need to open source. It's all or nothing. It really isn't. So documentation is a great thing to open source, and I found that, again, at every single company I've gone to, as soon as we open source the documentation, people start adding their projects to it, or they start fixing code samples, or they start fixing things in the library itself. Same with the tutorials. Allowing people to contribute to that documentation is great, because they're often the people who know what they need. If something is not clear to somebody who's reading something, then they're the person that's in a great position to fix it. SDKs, again, the people who are using these things, the people who need these things can tell you what they need as long as these things are open. And it's actually kind of tricky to not have an open source SDK that you expect other people to use, but I've seen people try. Libraries and tools, these are usually not secret things. So PagerDuty would open source little things here and there that helped with the messaging pipeline, not necessarily the messaging pipeline itself, but messaging dispatchers and things, or front-end components that we made use of. Nexmo is doing that as well. There's a front-end like UI framework that we've created that's open called Volta, and it's just out there for other people to use. It's similar to Bootstrap, but it's what we're doing internally to make sure that all of our things are sort of on brand, and it's not a secret. Anybody could go out there and do that, so why not just open source that? Same with frameworks. Things that you create in order to help you create some other things, those little framework tools, those are great to open source. Other people might find them useful, other people might not find them useful, but the point is that it's out there for someone else to look at, it's out there for people to learn from, even if they're not going to do it. Same with modules. And you might even consider open sourcing some configuration files. And I see that I say this and people's eyes get all wide. They're like, why would I open source a configuration file? That's terrifying. Yes, it is, but sometimes that's what you need to do. So I'm not saying you should open source all your config files with all of your keys in it. Please don't think that I'm saying that. But sometimes those configuration files, it's great to have those under source control, and it's great to, if you can scrub them properly, have those out there for other people to learn from or other people to make use of. So that has been me ranting at you for a little while, and I want to thank you so much for coming out today. Hopefully you realize by now that transparency is the key to all of these things, whether it is an open source software project, whether it is your organization. So I hope I convinced you to be more transparent with at least something, whether it is your organization or maybe even open sourcing your code. If I didn't, then please come talk to me. We've got some time for Q&A if people have questions.
So if we can just thank Amanda for her talk first. First put your hand up.
Hi, great talk. Very interesting. I definitely work for an organisation that is not very open source. But what I'm interested to know a little bit more about is how do you think open source can help with the hiring process, particularly hiring developers, which is a very competitive and difficult market?
Yeah, so that works in two ways. So if they have a bunch of open source things, you can get a feel for what their code is like, how they approach things. And then for your organization, I personally love when companies I'm applying to work for have some sort of open source thing, because that tells me a lot about their process and what working there might be like. So I've found it helpful on really both ends of that spectrum. And I've looked at some projects that companies open sourced, and honestly was terrible, and I was like, all right, well, I can either bang my head against this and hope that I can help this organization, or sometimes my opinion is, no, I've looked at the code and I've looked at their backlog of issues, and honestly, this would probably just frustrate me. So on both ends of that, I really found it helpful.
Hi there. Thanks a lot for the talk. Do you find transparency within a company, say, as an unfettered good, or are there common trade-offs that you find kind of need to be made with everyone kind of having access to everything, everyone being able to sit in whatever meeting? I mean, it's good, but it's quite an optimistic view. So is there any kind of are there any caveats that you would say?
Yeah, so I think the largest one for me is that when you have all of those meetings and training, people sometimes are about it and they want to do all of them. And you as a manager really have to watch that and make sure that people aren't sinking their time into something that is maybe not the best use of their time. So you do have to have a responsible organization, and honestly, you have to have some really direct conversations with people sometimes. And I think those are the trade-offs. A lot of people, I notice it more in the US, people are not willing to be direct. They want to sugarcoat things and be nice about it, and that doesn't necessarily always work. So I think, yeah, the time management and the willingness to have the hard conversations have been the most common trade-offs for me. And that's really what it takes in order to make that transparency work.
Thank you for a great talk. I'm convinced. We've got some internal libraries that are very generic that we think we'd like to open source. What are the steps we should go through in order to take our internal source code, open up to the community? What do we need to put in place in order to curate it, support it, get back from it?
So I hate to suggest this, but maybe talk to a lawyer, because you're going to have to figure out licensing things, and it gets crazy. No matter what country you're in, where you're sitting, what the project is, sometimes that gets a little wild. So I hate to suggest that, but is probably my first suggestion with the licensing stuff, because you will need the license. You'll have to figure out what sort of license you want to release that under, and it's just easier to pay somebody to figure that out, at least in my experience. And then beyond that, just scrubbing the code, make sure you haven't put anything in there that you shouldn't. Sometimes that happens. There are some cases where I've just decided, you know what, I'm going to keep this repo private, and I'll move the code in like a new commit, new project, just to get rid of the history in case I've committed things that shouldn't be there. Really up to you to decide how you want to manage that. And then beyond that, I think the hardest part is building awareness and promoting the fact that that library is out there, promoting the fact that people can contribute to it. Unfortunately, the answer for that is it depends. Like, it depends on what your goals are with that. If you're just trying to get it out there, then just throw it up on GitHub. If you're actually trying to get people to use it and contribute to it, then that becomes a little more complicated, and you'll have to figure out the best way to do that given what the library is and get it in front of people.
One question for me. We are a self-steering company at my company, and one problem for us is documenting stuff because, well, we don't use a good structure. We try to put everything in Confluence, and that really gets messed up. Do you have any tips for like a tool you use or a documentation structure that could help us?
Yeah, so the internal things that I've seen that have worked really well are breaking the wiki into sections by team, and then each team is really responsible for maintaining that certain segment. I think it sounds like there might be an ownership problem, if I'm honest. Somebody needs to own that and not necessarily be the gatekeeper for any changes, but just be tasked with curating that and making sure that everything in there is where it needs to be. And then as far as the structure of the docs, I'm sure amongst the teams there are common elements like things like team structure, or if you have some infrastructure, then mapping out that infrastructure and figure out the things that are important, the things that you would want to know from another team, the things that you think are important to let other teams know about, and maybe generate your structure from there. See if you can, I guess, place the information into specific buckets and then fill out those buckets with the things that you think you need.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any more questions? Nope, we're all good.
No? Okay.
We just thank Amanda again for
Thank you.
talk.